take an opportunity to tell you I've got some good news for you and some bad news for you. So what we're going to do is part one is going to be the bad news. And then part two is going to be the good news. Now, it's not going to be all bad, but it's not going to be pleasant going through this because we're talking about conflict. And the key is this: conflict is everywhere. Small children need to be guided through conflict when they learn about sharing and they scream, and you've all heard this, but that's mine. Adolescents can use some serious education through conflict when they begin to believe that their parents are ignorant and they rebelliously demand their ways. Adults, especially spouses, need practical coaching when they clash with one another's viewpoints on issues of importance. Brethren sometimes need to be refocused on the highest spiritual principles as we deal with our disagreements regarding doctrine, behavior, morality, and priorities. The scriptures are full of conflict. Yes? Is there an issue?
Go ahead, Brother David. Go ahead, Brother Break. I had to mute somebody.
Oh, okay. Let me just back up to that previous sentence about brethren sometimes need to be refocused on their highest spiritual principles as we deal with our disagreements regarding doctrine, behavior, morality, and priorities. The scriptures are full of conflict and its resolution. This will be the first, as we mentioned, of a two-part discussion on the matter of conflict. In this hour, what we want to do is bluntly lay out what conflict in its unresolved state looks like. What conflict in its unresolved state looks like. That's an important aspect of this discussion. And to be honest with you, I thought long and hard about, do I want to spend an entire hour talking about the negative side? And the reason that we chose to go ahead with that was to make sure that we all clearly understand what it is that we're dealing with. So it might not be pretty, but so be sure to listen to part two, brethren, tomorrow afternoon, where we're going to discuss conflict resolution. So some of the basis for today's discussion is taken from a conference that I attended years and years and years ago called Reality Leadership, presented by Dr. John C. Maxwell, who's a well-known leadership author and teacher. And there are the five basic principles are what I borrowed from Mr. Maxwell and applied them to our spiritual lives. So let's start by asking the question, where does conflict come from? And the answer is a lot of places. To begin with, let's look at conflict that's my fault. We're only going to cite, now we're going to go through several scriptures and give you several examples, but we're not going to expand on them. We're just going to lay them on the table. For instance, first point, conflict may come when we don't get what we want. Example, Satan's desires were bigger than his being. We all know Isaiah 14, verses 13 to 14. But you said in your heart, speaking of Satan prophetically, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the cloud. I will make myself like the Most High. That created conflict. Pride is often central in conflict. Another example, conflict may come when we put our impulses above our sense. Eve is a good example. Eve made an impulsive choice in the moment rather than relying on previously plainly stated truth. In Genesis 3:6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Impulsive action fed conflict. Adam and Eve were now in conflict with their creator. Another way conflict can come from me. Conflict may come from resentment. Example, Cain was given a solution to his unacceptable sacrifice, but he instead acted out of jealous resentment. He was given a solution, but he acted out of jealous resentment. Genesis chapter 4, verses 5 and verses 8 and 9. But for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. That is, God had no regard. So Cain became very angry and his countenance fell. Moving to verse 8, Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and he killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Resentment magnifies conflict. And of course, we have the worst possible end to that particular conflict. Another example of conflict coming from me. Conflict may come when our choice of words is not clearly understood. Now, let's suppose you're concerned about somebody and you ask them, what's wrong with you? It may not come across the right way. Instead, maybe we should have said, well, what's troubling you? Just a way of expressing that our words can easily be misunderstood by others. I'm going to give an example of Jesus and his words being misunderstood, not because he misrepresented them, but because the hearers just weren't listening. John chapter 21, verses 21 to 23. So Peter, seeing John, said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? And Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Therefore, the saying went out among the brethren that the disciple would not die, that disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? So again, obviously, Jesus did not improperly express himself in this example. This text is to simply illustrate how words can be easily misunderstood and misapplied. So having our words applied out of context can give conflict momentum. So all of these things that we just mentioned are ways conflict can come from me as an individual. We all have the ability to feed conflict. Second, let's examine very quickly, and we're just laying these on the table as kind of a basis to understand that conflict is a broad-based issue that we all have to deal with in our Christian walk. Let's examine conflict that comes from circumstantial things, okay, has a circumstantial fault. For instance, conflict may come when there are issues with more than one potential solution. Defining faithfulness in imperfect Christians can have a lot of variation. What is required of me may not be required of you. Let's look at very quickly Romans 14, verses 2 and 3. And again, brethren, we're just laying these things out as examples. These are not here for discussion. We're going to get into the degenerating stages of conflict and follow what happens when we allow conflict to get out of hand further and further and further. But for now, again, Romans 14, chapter 14, verses 2 and 3. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. You can do an entire hour on this text and the importance of understanding the conscience of another. And sometimes issues have more than one solution, and we need to be able to relate to that fact. Another example, conflict may come from change. Now, some of us really don't like change. Some of us really embrace change. Jewish Christians, back in the time of the writing of the New Testament, had serious and honest challenges with their newfound freedom in Christ. If we take a quick look at Acts 15, 1 and 2, it's a wonderful example. Some men came down from Judea to begin teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And when Paul and Barnabas had this great dissension and debate with them, the brethren determined that Paul and Barnabas and some others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders concerning this issue. So you think about that, and the issue was, we're talking about the circumcision according to Moses. And without that, of course, you can't be saved because you can't be one of God's chosen people. And remember, that circumcision went even before then. So they had a legitimate concern based on generations and generations and generations and generations of history. That created a major conflict in the early church that had to be dealt with. And that's where the conference at Jerusalem in Acts 15 had its founding, to deal with such a conflict. Another example, conflict may come when we have legitimately different perspectives on things, okay? You had a very serious command of God in that last example. You had circumcision as being one of the rights of being one of his chosen people. This is different. This is different perspectives. Let's use the example, and we're all familiar with it, of Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas parted ways over a conflict. Go to Acts 15, same chapter after the conference. Acts 15, verses 36 to 40. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let's return and visit the brethren in every city in which we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting they should not take him along, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another. And Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas, and left. So the conflict between these two co-laborers was so deep, they parted ways. The conflict over the previous conduct of John Mark, whether he had outgrown that conduct or not, they parted ways. So conflict can easily arise when we have legitimate differences in perspectives. That now Barnabas and John Mark were related. So Barnabas probably had very, very, very good reason to believe in John Mark. The Apostle Paul obviously had very good reason to doubt his maturity. You had this conflict, you had these different perspectives, and they parted ways. Didn't mean they parted from working with one another in the gospel. They parted at that moment. And we all know that John Mark became very valuable to the Apostle Paul later on. So legitimate differences cannot help but create conflict sometimes. And our last example of how conflict arises from circumstances and so forth. Conflict often thrives on what we say, which reflects how we feel. James chapter 3, verses 2, and then we're going to go to verses 10 through 12. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he's a perfect man and able to bridle the whole body as well. From the same mouth comes both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does not a fountain send forth from its same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. It doesn't make sense. So conflict thrives on the kinds of things that we say, and they reflect how we feel. And sometimes that gets us into conflict, into trouble. So to look at conflict, we want to have clarity in the whole matter. So conflict clarity, and summing up the points we just laid on the table as examples. Conflict thrives because we are conflicted beings. Whether we cause it, whether we contribute to it, or whether we have it come to us, we must learn to manage conflict in a God-glorifying way. Now, brethren, let me just add here, how often is our default way of managing conflict to ignore it? Maybe if I look over here, maybe it won't see me and I won't see it, and maybe it'll go away. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. We are called to a higher purpose. And part of that is to deal with these difficult things head on as best as we can. Okay. So if we really want to manage serious conflicts, we need to have very, very clear understanding of what we're dealing with. So let's look at the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees. Now, there's a relationship that grew into conflict even unto death. Okay, we're going to look at that relationship and how it degenerated as time went on, not because of what Jesus did or taught, but because of what the Pharisees did as they continued to close their hearts and their eyes to the truth that was before them. So Jesus and the Pharisees were in this amazing conflict that brought Jesus to his crucifixion. How did that get there? It wasn't because Jesus was doing something wrong, but it was because there was a side of this issue that was closed to hearing, closed to seeing, closed to discussing, closed to communicating, closed to just simply listening. We're going to propose to you that there are 5 degenerating stages of conflict. 5. So in each one, we're going to introduce what we call a conflict management reality. What's the reality that we're dealing with as we get to this particular stage? At this first stage, what we're going to see is this is where everything can actually work out. So you want to pay close attention to this. Conflict management reality. And I know I'm throwing a lot of things. I got 5 of these things, and there's going to be 4 subpoints that are going to be just reflected throughout the entire conversation today and tomorrow in relation to us. And I'll reiterate them in a moment. Every personal opinion, preference, passion, or principle that I hold can become the center of conflict in my life. I must always remember that as I have these opinions, preferences, passions, and principles, so I must recognize that others will have them as well. So as we look at conflict, we want to look at it in a very personal way. Every one of us has personal opinions. Every one of us has preferences. Every one of us has passion. And every one of us strives to follow principle, clear, godly, righteous principles. It's that when we have all of these 4 things working, that conflict begins to rise up. So the first stage of the degenerating stages of conflict is the remedy stage. This is the best stage. Whenever you have a conflict, stay here. The remedy stage, this is where you have a desire to actually fix the conflict. And it has been said, again, from John Maxwell, 80 to 85% of conflicts can actually be resolved at this stage. There's some basic points here. First of all, commitment. There's a commitment to fix the problem. In order to have something be able to be fixed, you have to be committed to fixing it. Second, there's a belief that it can be solved. So you're committed to fixing it, and you actually believe it can happen. And third, brethren, there is honest communication. Now, here's the opposite side of that is by attacking when we're in conflict, by attacking those we're in conflict, we are actually retreating from resolution. If we are attacking those we're in conflict with, we are running away from the ability to resolve. Just let's keep that in mind. The Pharisees, we're going to use the Pharisees as an example. The Pharisees asked a simple question and what potentially could have been a very honest question of Jesus. Now, they asked a lot of questions. We're going to use some experiences in Mark chapter 2. So if you're following along with the scriptures, go to Mark chapter 2 and kind of stay there. And then we're going to go to James chapter 3 as well. Those are going to be our 2 mainstays when we discuss conflict today. So Mark 2, 15 to 17, a question is asked that could be a basis for conversation and learning. Didn't end up that way, but it could have been. Mark 2:15. And it happened that when he was reclining at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of them, they were following him. When the scribes of Pharisees saw that he was eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, let's pause there. That could be a good, legitimate, honest question. This is something we haven't seen. Can you explain that to us? And hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." That's a relatively benign answer. I'm eating with them because they need guidance. What a wonderful answer. If it were an honest question, it would have stimulated thought and discussion. Well, what do you mean by that? It wasn't an honest question. So even though we're using this as the example of what could have been, truly in the example it wasn't. But for the sake of following the Pharisees in these degenerating stages, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt that there may have been something small in there that could have had some sincerity. So we look at conflict clarity with this. Here's the question we want to ask ourselves. When I see something that conflicts with my personal opinions, preferences, passions, or principles that I stand by, what questions do I ask? And how do I ask them? What questions do I ask? And how do I ask them? It's not so much asking the question. It's very much, how do I ask it? That is going to reflect whether we are in this remedy stage of honestly wanting to know. Moving on to our next point. So the remedy stage, that's the stage you want to stay at. The next point, our conflict management reality, to set the basis for it. And again, we're coming back to those four things. And I'm going to repeat a lot of things today because we need to understand how vital it is to know that all of these things exist in each of us. Conflict management reality for stage 2, which is coming up, because my personal opinions, preferences, and passions are so ingrained in me, I am liable to easily elevate any of those things to the status of a principle. Say it again, because my personal opinions, preferences, and passions are so ingrained, I am likely to take any of those things and say it's a principle because I am so passionate about it. We have to be careful. The second stage of the degenerating stages of conflict is the repositioning stage. Instead of having a desire to fix the problem, now we're looking for who made this problem anyway? Who caused it? We're looking to point a finger of blame. 50% of conflicts can be resolved here. We went from 80 to 85 to 50. That's a pretty significant drop. Why? Because here, people are nervous, defensive, and protective. It's got to be them. They must have done it. It's what they said. It's what they believe. It's what they did. Second, there's a lower level of trust that is just underlying. Third, communication now is really cautious. You don't have that trust, any sense of that strong trust back and forth that, okay, you said that, but did you really mean that? That's what would have happened at the remedy stage. You said that, and okay, I can see how you caused the problem now. So we're in much more of a pointing the finger. Who caused this problem? Let's look at the Pharisees in our Mark chapter 2 examples. The Pharisees now point a finger of accusation. And this is a few verses later. We're going to go to Mark 2, 24 to 26. They point a finger of accusation after the disciples pluck grain from the fields, remember, on the Sabbath. And, they're walking with Jesus. And so they come in, and in Mark 2, 24 to 26, the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, when you take that question and you mirror it against the previous question, why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners? You see how this one is more is harsh. So there's much more of a harsh approach to it. Okay, much more of a finger pointing. Why are they doing which is not legal? Jesus said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him. Jesus didn't have to hesitate, didn't have to stop and think, wow, what a tough question. He knew, he understood, and he was free. He was free in giving the answer. They're not doing anything that's wrong. There's scriptural precedent by David himself. Here's the thing. What the Pharisees did is they asked their question, and it was based on a predetermined answer. Well, why are they doing that which is not lawful on the Sabbath? Well, it's, you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, so therefore they're doing something wrong. They didn't even consider in the question that there could be an answer. So you had that predetermined approach. So asking a question based on a predetermined answer displays defensiveness and a lack of trust. And I think in the case of the Pharisees, they were very, very threatened by Jesus. And at this point, they're looking at to try to find some fault in this man because he's so different, and it's disturbing to see such wisdom from such simplicity and to see the healing without going through them and getting their authorization first, so to speak. So we have this sense of repositioning, looking for who's causing the problem. And there's the defensiveness and protectiveness. And as we look at the example of the Pharisees, brethren, let's do a hard thing here. Let's look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, Brother Rick, do I ever get this way? Do I ever get defensive and protective? Do I lower my trust in this situation or that situation with this or that person? Is my communication now really, really cautious? instead of looking for open, honest responses. James chapter 3, we mentioned James 3. We're going to jump through parts of James 3 because they really reflect what happens in our Christian lives in these stages of conflict. Now, the first stage was remedy. That's good. Second stage is repositioning. So they must have caused the problem. James 3, verses 8 through 10. But no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father. With it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. We shouldn't be doing that. That is not appropriate for us to be doing. James is warning us all about the repositioning. You have to be above board. You have to be in a higher place than you are when you are just purely natural and you're letting your tongue just wag without the harness of God's Spirit. So when we look at conflict clarity in this second stage, when I am faced with something that conflicts with my perceived principles, okay, remember that was one of those four things: personal opinions, preferences, passion, and principles. When I am faced with something that conflicts with my perceived principles, do I begin to draw conclusions before I seek more information? And the reason I put the word perceived in there, it was very, very specific because, okay, I believe I'm standing for principle, but what if I haven't seen everything from that brother or sister's point of view? What if there's something that I need to consider? It's worth, because I trust them, it is worth looking into what's behind it. And when we start to lose that, we're now looking at pointing the finger. Moving on to the third stage. We had the first stage where you can solve things, the second stage where you're now looking for blame. So our conflict management reality to set the stage for this third one. Once I have elevated my personal opinion, my preference, and my passion to the status of principle, I will begin to address conflict through judgment. Now, the only validation I seek is to verify what I have judged to be true or not. So, what can happen very easily with us as human beings? And brethren, you look at some of the conflicts in Scripture, and you can see these things actually happening in Scripture. So this is not something we're saying, well, this is a 21st century problem. This is a human problem. This is a human problem that has existed. And again, by God's grace, brethren, please, part 2, we're going to go through these again and look at them entirely differently. We'll look at them from the standpoint of, how do I deal with this? How do I stand against this? How do I rise above this? That's what's coming in part 2. So this third stage, this third degenerating stage of conflict, is the I'm right, you're wrong stage. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm no longer looking for blame. I already know you're wrong. Okay. I mean, it's pretty simple. We've got a conflict. You're wrong. Just admit it. Just change your ways and let's move on. It's no wonder that only 15 to 20% of conflict can be resolved here. Here's what happens at this stage. People take sides and they're labeled. And tell me, I'm going to pause here for a second, and we're not going to talk about this, but I'm bringing it up. Look at our social environment today. Look at the political breakdowns of things. Don't want to get involved in politics, have no desire to. But look at how one side treats the other and the other side treats the one. And tell me if this doesn't sound very much like this particular stage. I'm right, you're wrong. Here's what happens. People take sides and are labeled. In a Christian environment, the other side is probably too worldly or deceived. In this stage, you're in a mode to win. It becomes win or lose. And in this stage, communication is distorted and overstated. It's at this stage where sarcasm, exaggeration, they just creep right in. And we make that small fire of conflict a blazing, raging inferno. when we attack others, when we're in conflict, especially at this third stage, I'm right, you're wrong. And remember, there's two more stages after this. This sounds pretty bad, but there's two more after this. What we're doing here is we're attacking, when we attack others in conflict with the I'm right and you're wrong, what we're doing is we're retreating from reason. We're not even giving reason a chance. And that's exactly what the Pharisees did. The Pharisees had no more need for questions. So now they simply looked for reasons to accuse. In Mark chapter 3, we're going to look at verses 1, 2, and 6. Mark 3, 1, 2, and 6. He entered again into the synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. They were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath so they might accuse him. We're right, he's wrong. Wait, here it is. I'll bet he's going to do this, and we can nail him for this. Jesus knows their heart in the next few verses. He challenges their thinking. And then he probably looks right at the Pharisees, and then he heals the man. The Pharisees went out immediately, began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. Didn't need any more reason. We're right. He's wrong. Let's just wait. Here comes the proof. Let's get him. When we are so stuck in our position of being right, we become blind to potential evidence that can lead us to truth. In that case, the man was miraculously healed. I don't know about you, but you look at that, that's pretty good evidence that Jesus comes from God. Pretty good evidence. And yet when we get there, we can't see truth. James 3, let's go to verses 14 through 16. James 3, 14 through 16. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. Where there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there's disorder and every evil thing. Third stage, I'm right, you're wrong. Clarity on this. Once I have, unfortunately, decided to address conflict through my predetermined perspective, do I now look to entrap those whom I have judged in their actions to simply prove my point? Rather than we take away another's ability to be for whatever reason they are, because we don't even bother to want to listen. Because they're wrong. What's the sense? Is that Christ-like? Not at all. Let's set the stage for the fourth stage of degenerating conflict. So the conflict management reality here is this, okay? And you can see how these realities are going downhill further and further and further. And you might think that, wow, I'm right and you're wrong. That's pretty dramatic, and it is. It is. And we've dropped to about 15 to 20% resolution here, okay? But it can get much worse. Having prejudged without scriptural process and mercy, all that's left is to remove those with whom we have conflict. One who acts based upon the application of godly principles could not be here at this stage without thorough, open-minded, and merciful dialogue, which seeks to give the benefit of doubt. So if we, as consecrated individuals, have thorough, open-minded, and merciful dialogue, which seeks to give the benefit of the doubt, that really wants to know, we're not going to get here. We're not going to get to this fourth stage, because this fourth stage is the removal stage. Get rid of them. And it's no wonder that about 1% of conflicts can be resolved here. It's almost impossible. Well, what's the goal? Well, in the secular world, the goal is separation. It's divorce. The goal is argumentative disunity. It's resentful disassociation. See, sometimes we disassociate because it makes sense to do that. But there's a difference between that and resentful disassociation. Get rid of them. They're not worth my time. They're wrong, and now we just need to be done with them. And again, look at the world around us and tell me if this is not something that's happening. There's no solution. It's just the only thing to do is be gone. I can't have you in my life anymore. Can't even hear your name anymore. And when it comes to communication, that's laughable because there's no trust to base it on. And folks, I'm sorry. That's what I say on the podcast. I apologize, brethren. Brethren, communication, when we lose our ability to communicate, we lose everything in relation to one another. Let us not go there. There's no trust here. And so therefore there can be no communication. So let's move on to another account of the Pharisees as an example. The Pharisees now seek Jesus' removal as he's just too much trouble for them. He just is literally too much trouble. Let's turn to Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, verses 12 to 14. Mark 12, 12 to 14. And they were seeking to seize him, yet they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke the parable against them. So they know that Jesus has got their number, and they are definitely looking to find a way to be rid of this problem. But the people are too much on his side. And so they left him and went away. Then they sent some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement. Okay, we'll get him in a different way. What's the object? Get rid of him. We'll get him in a different way. They came and said to him, Teacher, think about it. They approach him and say, Teacher. They're not approaching him as teacher. They're approaching him as lawbreaker. So they're completely hiding what they're doing because all they want is get rid of him. Here's their statement, and listen to the hypocrisy. We know that you are truthful and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Stop right there. If that's the case, then you better listen to what he says. And then they ask the question, is it lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? Well, we know what happens. Jesus calls out their hypocrisy and gives a powerful and unexpected answer. Acting in this manner reveals the enormous flaw of being driven by emotion and pride while ignoring any clarity of truth. We've got to trap him so we can get rid of him. So we'll pretend that we're going to be nice to him. We'll pretend to respect him. Brethren, do we ever get into that place in our lives where we okay, I'll act like I'm listening. Whereas we'd rather be, I just don't want to deal with this person. Just get them away. Think about this, because we are moving away from godliness when we go down this far. Get rid of them. James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. James 4, 1 to 3. What is the source of quarrelings and conflicts among you? Is it not the source of your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and you do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with the wrong motive so that you may spend it on your pleasures. James is telling us that when we get into an earthly way of thinking with the spiritual mind available, we are going down the wrong roads. We're going down the degenerating stages of conflict. And brethren, when we get down as far as this one, and this isn't the worst one, when we get down as far as this, it is very unpleasant. And James calls us out on this. Do not use earthly, lustful thinking and desires to drive you. And don't pretend that your earthly desires are spiritual principles. James is looking to cut through all of this. Let me pause for a moment. Are you having fun yet? Isn't this exciting? Isn't this uplifting? Brethren, this is being said so that we can set the table to understand how heinous our conflicts can become, so that we can work on truly solving and working through them as brothers and sisters in Christ. because it's too important. And just let me take another quick side road. COVID-19 and our condition of our conventions has not been helpful. Now, let me explain. I'm not criticizing in any way, shape, matter, or form the ability to have conventions on Zoom. That is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But the inability to have conventions in person is tragic. The inability to have that personal fellowship and that personal connection is devastating. And our conflicts, when they seem to arise in this particular context, are even harder to deal with than they were before, because it's harder to seek somebody out. It's harder to have a face-to-face conversation. You know, you can go to a convention and you're having a problem with somebody, you say, you know, when I get there, I'm going to talk to them. And God bless you for that attitude. But here, it's not going to work. So we need to be more alert than ever before in our dealing with whatever conflicts may be arising and whatever conflicts I may feel in my own heart toward one or another, and be willing to deal with those things. And you have to deal with it outside of the convention environment. So be aware that this is a very real issue. And as the world degenerates along these stages of conflict, let us not follow along with them. Just because it's okay out in the world to label others on the other side as being the ones that were at fault and now wanting to get rid of them doesn't mean we have that right as well. So conflict clarity, as we wrap up this fourth stage, the get rid of those people stage. Do I ever recognize it when I am here in this miserable and dark state of satanic thinking and behavior? That's what James just described. When I'm in this condition, this get rid of those people condition, and I look for Christ in me, what am I going to find? Let's be brave enough to ask ourselves that question. We get to the fifth stage, the fifth degenerating stage of conflict. Setting the table for it, conflict management reality. Once I've abandoned righteous and biblical principles in exchange for the evil of, and here are the evils: accusation without listening, judgment without justice, condemnation without mercy. When I've gone down those roads, I must realize it is I, Brother Rick Sarasi. I must realize it is I who goes before the judgment of God through Christ. I am putting myself in a position to be judged. It's not a good place to be. This fifth stage of the degenerating stages of conflict is the revenge stage. Not just get rid of them, make somebody pay. It's not enough to get them out of my sight. I want to make them pay. I want to inflict pain. I want to make sure they know this is the sorry end result of godless thinking. At this stage, people are fanatics and they fight a religious war. And it now becomes immoral to stop fighting. Doesn't matter what the truth is. It becomes immoral to stop fighting. And again, look at the world around us and tell me this is not what's going on right now. This is why we need to be so aware, because we are being desensitized to godly principles, which are way up here, by the grossness of how far the world has gone from righteousness. Do not let that affect you. By attacking others when in conflict, and we get to this point, what we're doing is we're retreating from godliness. We're retreating from it. We're walking away from godliness. Pharisees did that. The Pharisees became a runaway train as they now sought the life of Jesus with full force. With everything in them, they sought his life. John 11, verses 47 to 50, and then verse 53. John 11, 47 to 50 and 53. Therefore, the chief priests and Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Let's pause there for a second. What are we doing? He's ruining us by doing all these godly things. That's essentially what they're saying. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people and the whole nation not perish." Now, prophetically, there was something good in that because one man did have to die for the people, but not in the way Caiaphas was saying. Verse 53. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. It's not enough to ignore him. It's not enough to talk bad about him, to start the rumors. We need to kill him. We need to take him off the scene. He must pay. This is the way they addressed our Lord. He must pay. You don't resolve conflict at this stage. A pattern of mishandling conflict can shockingly and sadly, it can easily bring us to personally becoming a human weapon of mass destruction. Brethren, this is serious. Here's how James describes when we go too far down these roads of earthly thinking. James chapter 4, verse 4. You adulteresses. Let's pause right there. How does that make you feel? If James is saying when you engage in earthly thinking, you start to go down these roads, he's calling us adulteresses. Do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? You can't be friends with the world and loyal to God. You've made a choice, stay with the godly choice. Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Fifth stage, make someone pay. Got to be careful. So our clarity here. Have I ever traveled down the slippery slope of darkness and ego, even in the small conflicts of my life? Have I ever gotten to a point in any of my conflicts where it's make them pay? How did I get here? What can I do? Well, again, brother, in part two, we want to put this all in a much happier perspective. So here, as we begin to wrap this up, part one is designed to say conflict is serious and it can degenerate to a point of being one of the most destructive things that happens to us. We must be aware and be bold enough to stand up against it. Again, part two, we'll get into that. When conflict is allowed to degenerate, the results are tragic. If we find that we've allowed this process to progress, let's continue to follow James. I mean, James has been good for us all the way through this. Okay. He's been calling things out. Here's what he says. Here's what James tells us to do. Now, he's been calling out everything all along these degenerating stages, right? Now, James chapter 4, verses 7 to 10. Here's where the answers come from. Submit. Let's pause right there. That one word can change everything. Submit, therefore, to God. Next word, resist. Resist the devil, he will flee from you. Next two words, draw near. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Next word, cleanse. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. And then be miserable, mourn, and weep. Why? Because what you've done is pretty serious. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into gloom. And in verse 10, humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you. So after all of the things that James was saying were bringing you down and bringing you down and bringing you down, here's where he brings this particular conversation to an end. Be humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he can then exalt you. But it has to be being humble to the Lord, not to something or somebody else. We must always remember who we are, what our privilege is, and what is expected of us. Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 to 14. So as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against you, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Brethren, there's so much in these last two scriptures. And I could not leave you with just the mess of the 5 degenerating stages without putting something in place to say there is hope. If we have allowed ourselves to go down in any way, shape, or form, any of these roads, any of these stages, there is hope, but we need to be aware. We need to be dedicated to standing for that which is right. In closing, brethren, conflicts happen. They just do. It's part of our world. If you would like to find a way to avoid conflict, you will find a way to avoid faithfulness. That's just the truth. We cannot avoid it. Therefore, we need to work through it. Left to our natural reactions, conflicts generally go in the wrong direction and end up becoming powerful tools of the adversary. They destroy trust. They plant untruth, exaggeration, and false conclusions in our hearts and our minds. And we can forever, in this age anyway, forever negatively alter the way we see those on the other side. Let us here and now decide that we will not participate in these deadly and degenerating stages of conflict, but rather stand against that current.